room didn't react when it happened. That's how I knew it was final. No sound marked the moment, just air rearranging itself between us. I was waiting for a sentence, you were waiting for it to pass. Nothing collapsed, which made it harder to recognize the ending. We sat inside the familiar, like it still owed us something. Your hand stayed calm, that was the first betrayal. I understood too late that calm is not peace. It's the absence of intention disguised as control. I searched your face for effort, found only completion. You weren't thinking anymore, you had already arrived somewhere else. I kept speaking internally, as if volume could change direction. The silence wasn't empty, it was already decided. I noticed how still you were, stillness with no curiosity left. That's when I realized the conversation had ended before it started. You didn't interrupt me, because there was nothing to interrupt. I kept waiting for resistance, like proof that I mattered. Nothing argued back, nothing tried to stay. The day nothing was said was louder than every night we fought. I replayed it later, trying to locate the exact second. But the moment didn't exist, only the absence of one. I learned that endings don't always arrive. Sometimes they've been waiting for you to notice that you're alone in the room. You didn't leave, you stopped participating, and I stayed long enough to misname it patience. I blame timing, because it felt less personal. But timing didn't fail us, attention did. The silence had weight, because it carried your decision. You didn't explain, which meant there was nothing left to discuss. I finally understood some truths don't need language, they only need stillness and someone brave enough to read it. The day nothing was said was the day I stopped asking. Not because I got answers, but because the question dissolved. I stood up without drama, even my body agreed. Leaving felt unnecessary, because nothing was holding me. That was the clarity I had been waiting for. You didn't end us, you simply didn't continue. And I learned the difference between being quiet and being gone. The day nothing was said was the day I heard everything. before I did. Even though we entered together, there was a chair beside you. You never thought to move. I noticed it immediately, how space had already chosen sides. You sat comfortably, as if comfort required no awareness. I stood longer than necessary, waiting for an instinct that didn't come. You spoke casually, like nothing had shifted at all. The chair stayed untouched, witness to something unspoken. I realized then how absence can be arranged silently. You didn't refuse me a place, you simply didn't consider it. The room adjusted around you, I adjusted around the room. You leaned back, certain of your position. I leaned nowhere because there was nowhere to lean. I told myself it was nothing. Furniture doesn't decide meaning, but meaning often hides inside ordinary neglect. You talked about your day, I listened for signs of inclusion unarrived, and you didn't notice their absence. I could have pulled the chair myself, but I didn't want to teach awareness. There's a difference between asking and being considered. You weren't unkind, you were uninterrupted. I watched your ease carefully, trying to learn it. The chair remained empty like an unanswered question. You never said sit, and I never asked why. Politeness filled the space where honesty should have been. I smiled at the right moment so nothing would feel wrong, but nothing felt right either. It felt arranged without me. I noticed how naturally you occupied space, how little you checked its borders. You didn't push me aside, you simply expanded. I reduced myself politely to avoid collision. The chair you didn't pull back became heavier than it looked. It carried everything you didn't think to say. I realized then how often love assumes balance, but balance requires attention, not intention. You assumed I would adapt, I assumed you would notice. Both assumptions failed quietly. The chair stayed empty even when conversations paused. You never wondered why. That hurt more than the omission. I understood something important in that still moment. If I had sat, it would have been intrusion. If you had invited me, it would have been alignment. Neither happened, and that was the answer. I stopped waiting for gestures that weren't native to you. You weren't withholding, you were complete without adjustment. The chair you didn't pull back was never about seating. It was about space and who it's shaped for. it where it was and moved myself instead. You didn't notice the change which confirmed everything. Some realizations don't arrive loudly, they arrive furnished. And once you see them, you can't pretend the room is the same. The chair stayed empty long after I stopped standing. Not because I left, but because I finally understood why I was never meant to sit. You began speaking with confidence, as if the end had already agreed with you. Your voice slow and midway, like it reached something you didn't want to name. I waited for the rest, not impatient, just aware. Some sentences collapse, not from interruption, but from truth. You looked away, as if the thought required privacy. I learned then how avoidance disguises itself as pause. You said I was trying to, and let the words dissolve. The silence after that was more deliberate than speech. You didn't forget the ending, you abandoned it consciously. I filled the gap with patience, mistaken delay for care. But patience can be a hiding place when clarity feels dangerous. You smiled slightly, as if the moment had passed. But moments don't pass, they stack quietly. I realized how often people stop talking when language reaches responsibility. Your unfinished sentence stayed with me longer than anything you said. It echoed without repetition, because I refused to complete it for you. Completion would have been collaboration, and I was done participating blindly. You changed the subject with professional smoothness. I noticed how quickly you moved on, like the sentence had never existed. But it did, it existed between us. Unfinished doesn't mean unclear, it means unresolved by choice. You assumed I wouldn't ask, I assumed you would return to it. Neither happened, and that was intentional on both sides. I stopped waiting for closure that depended on your courage. Some people leave sentences open so they don't have to stand by them. You kept your option alive by keeping your language incomplete. I carried the weight of what you avoided until I recognized the pattern. You weren't unsure, you were undecided on accountability. The sentence you never finished was a decision in disguise. I stopped listening for conclusions and started noticing patterns. You spoke fluently until it mattered. I learned how truth behaves when it's about to surface. It slows down, then disappears. You didn't lie, you withdrew mid-thought. was a difference, and I learned to recognize it. I no longer chase endings that refuse to arrive honestly. Unfinished sentences reveal more than declarations. You thought silence protected you, it only exposed the structure. I didn't need the rest of your sentence to understand it fully. The moment you stopped speaking, you told me everything I didn't ask you to finish, because I already had. And once a sentence is finished internally, it no longer needs permission. You kept your voice, I kept the clarity. The sentence you never finished became the reason I did. Some truths don't need to be spoken, they just need to be abandoned. You abandoned yours, and I finally stopped waiting beside it. Stood too close to leave, close enough to confuse distance with depth. Our shoulders almost touched, but our intentions never did. You stay within reach, so you wouldn't have to decide. I stay within range, so I wouldn't have to move. Closeness became our excuse for never choosing a direction. We mistook proximity for commitment because it required no courage. Every step away felt dramatic, so we perfected standing still. You said it's complicated when it was only unfinished. I learned how comfort disguises itself as something worth protecting. We shared the same space, not the same intention. Too close to walk away cleanly, too far to arrive anywhere. Our conversation circled, never advancing, never retreating. I watched you lean in, only when leaving became visible. You liked the tension, I carried the consequence. We stood so close, that movement felt like betrayal. Not because it was wrong, but because it would reveal something. You learned how to stay without promising, I learned how to wait without asking. Our nearness became fragile because it couldn't survive honesty. I noticed how often closeness replaces clarity when clarity threatens comfort. You stayed reachable, I stayed available, neither of us arrived. But we occupied time efficiently. We confused intensity with progress, because progress requires departure. Standing close made us feel involved without being responsible. I could feel your breath, but not your direction. We were timid with avoidance, experts at not deciding. Every moment asked for distance, we answered with hesitation. I stopped believing closeness meant safety when it started limiting truth. You leaned on familiarity, I leaned on hope, both bent quietly, neither supported movement. We stood close enough to feel like leaving would hurt someone, but staying was already costing us in smaller, quieter ways. You said now isn't the time, as if time was the obstacle. I realized we weren't blocked, we were comfortable. Closeness had become the compromise neither of us wanted to admit to. I began to understand why leaving requires space. You didn't pull me closer, you just didn't step back. And I mistook that for being wanted. We stood too close to leave, until leaving became the only honest act. Distance finally did what closeness never could. It clarified everything. I stepped back and the illusion collapsed immediately. You didn't follow me, 'cause you were never moving. We stood too close to leave, but not close enough to stay. Once I created space, I learned the truth of it. Closeness isn't connection when it resists direction. I didn't leave you suddenly, I just stopped standing still. And in the space between us, everything became obvious. I noticed it in your hands first, how steady they were when nothing was resolved. You weren't waiting, you were resting inside the pause. Your calm didn't feel earned, it felt decided. I was still measuring consequences. You had already stopped measuring at all. The room carried tension, but it didn't touch you. You listened without leaning forward, as if the outcome no longer concerned you. I mistook your silence for depth, until I saw how light it was. Calm can be a signal when it arrives too early. You weren't afraid of losing me, that's when it became clear. Your voice stayed even because nothing inside you was moving. I was still arranging my words carefully. You had already put yours down. The moment stretched and only one of us felt it. Your calm wasn't peace, it was distance wearing good posture. I ask questions, you answer without urgency. Urgency only belongs to those who still want something. I realized your calm had weight because it was final. aside. I felt the imbalance immediately. One person still negotiating, one person already concluded without announcing it. You didn't need reassurance, you didn't need clarity. That was the clearest sign that you were finished. Calm can look kind when it no longer includes you. I kept explaining, you kept nodding. Nodding is easy when agreement costs nothing. Your calm made space, but not for me. It made space for endings that didn't require conflict. I felt exposed in my intensity. Next to your settled tone, you weren't cruel, you were accurate. Accuracy doesn't shake, it simply stands. I realized I was still trying while you were already done. Your calm didn't invite discussion, it closed it politely. I stopped mid-sentence because nothing was listening anymore. The moment didn't hurt loudly, it clarified quietly. I understood then why calm can be devastating. It doesn't fight, it doesn't argue, it just doesn't stay. I saw myself reflected in how much I still cared. And you reflected nothing back because reflection requires presence. Your calm wasn't the absence of feeling, it was the absence of intention. I finally understood why you weren't reaching. You had already arrived somewhere I wasn't invited. The moment I realized you were calm was the moment I knew I was alone in the effort, and calm I learned is sometimes the sound of leaving, finishing its work. I stayed because you didn't stop me, not because you asked me to. There's a difference I learned too late between being wanted and being allowed. You never pulled me closer, you just didn't step away. And I mistook that space for an invitation. I told myself silence was trust, that comfort meant tension. You watched me remain like it wasn't your responsibility. I stayed because nothing pushed back, and resistance would have been easier. You never promised anything, which somehow felt honest. But honesty without direction is still abandonment in slow motion. I waited for a signal. You waited for nothing. You didn't say stay. You simply didn't say go. And I filled that gap with my own persistence. I carried the effort quietly, so it wouldn't look like pressure. You let me, and that became the answer. Staying felt mutual until I noticed I was the only one adjusting. You didn't need reassurance because you weren't risking anything. I was building reasons, you were maintaining neutrality. Neutrality can look gentle when you're not the one exposed. I stayed because leaving felt dramatic, and you made nothing dramatic. There's a comfort in ambiguity when you don't intend to move. I told myself patience was strength, but it was just hope wearing discipline. You never leaned in, you just didn't pull away. And I learned how dangerous that is for someone who still believes. I stayed because effort was familiar, leaving required clarity. You benefited from my presence without ever claiming it. I mistook access for intimacy because access was all I had. You didn't stop me because stopping me would have meant choosing. And choosing was something you carefully avoided. I stayed because the door was open, but no one was waiting on the other side. I kept showing up, you kept receiving. Receiving without holding. Feels calm, but it's empty. I realized too late that permission is not desire. You didn't stop me because you didn't need to. I was doing the staying for both of us and calling it balance. You never asked me to stay, and that should have been enough. I finally understood that silence can be a boundary, not a bridge. I stayed because you didn't stop me. Believing was the first time. I chose myself without needing approval. I didn't accuse you. I corrected my position. Staying wasn't loyalty, it was unchallenged habit. You didn't lose me, I reclaimed myself. And the moment I stepped back, nothing reached for me. That's when I knew staying had been optional, only for one of us. I stayed because you didn't stop me. I left because I finally did. Silence didn't arrive empty. It came carrying decisions. We let it sit between us like it wasn't already choosing. You called it peace. I felt it calculating distance. Every quiet moment removed something we didn't replace. We stopped correcting each other because correction required care. Silence made things easier that should have been faced. You learned how to stay calm. I learned how to stay alert. There's a difference. Only one of us noticed. We avoided conflict carefully, as if conflict was the danger. But silence charges slowly and never forgets interest. We stopped clarifying, and confusion made itself at home. Your quiet felt composed, mine felt unfinished. I kept listening for meaning. You stopped sending it. Silence isn't neutral. It always favors someone, usually the one already done deciding. We skipped difficult words and paid with accumulation. Every unsaid thing pressed gently against the next. You relaxed into the quiet. I tensed around it. That should have told me whose silence was serving. We stopped asking questions because answers risk movement. Silence preserved the surface while the depth emptied quietly. You mistook stillness for stability. I mistook patience for connection. Silence allowed us to remain without ever arriving. We didn't argue, we eroded. No moment broke us. That's what made it expensive. Silence didn't end us. It delayed the ending. Delayed endings cost more. They spread the damage evenly. I carried unresolved sentences like loose wires. You carry nothing, which should have been a signal. Silence spared us discomfort and stole our direction. We stayed polite while truth waited outside. You thought quiet meant maturity. I learned it meant avoidance. Silence gave us time, but took our honesty. Every pause grew heavier because it was never answered. You felt safe in the quiet. I felt erased. That difference matters even if no one names it. Silence made room, but not for repair. It protected appearances at the expense of substance. We didn't lose each other suddenly. We dissolved incrementally. Silence didn't shout. That's why it worked. It let us pretend nothing was wrong. But silence doesn't disappear. It invoices later what it cost us. Wasn't loud enough to notice until there was nothing left to explain. We could have spoken and risked disruption. Instead we stayed quiet and paid with distance. Silence didn't fail us. We used it wrong. What silence actually cost us was the chance to choose before the choice was made without us. I didn't leave angry, I left informed. There's a difference between escape and conclusion. I carried a version of myself you never noticed forming. It learned quietly while you stayed comfortable. I became someone in the margins of conversations that never deepened. You knew my presence, not my evolution. I adjusted without announcing it, because growth doesn't always ask permission. You remembered who I was already becoming someone else. I stayed long enough for the new version to stabilize. You spoke to familiarity, I answered from distance. We were no longer aligned, even when standing close. I realized you love the outline, not the movement inside it. You expected consistency, I required space. I learned how to be whole without being mirrored. That should have scared you. It didn't. You kept addressing the past, I kept answering from the present. There's a loneliness in being unseen accurately. I stopped correcting your image of me because it wasn't my job anymore. You never met the person who learned to stop waiting. You knew the one who explained, not the one who decided. I didn't announce my shift because it wasn't for approval. The version I became no longer needed permission. I noticed how little you asked about who I was becoming. That silence finished the work you didn't start. I grew in places you never entered. You stayed attached to memory. I moved toward accuracy. We weren't arguing. We weren't arguing. We were misaligned in time. You expected return, I required departure. I didn't leave to be understood, I left to be intact. You never met the version who stopped negotiating. I became quieter because clarity doesn't argue. I learned how to leave gently without explaining myself smaller. You thought I was still there because I didn't protest, but I was already packing internally long before the exit. I left with composure because I left complete. There was no performance, only movement. You didn't chase, which confirmed everything. I didn't disappear, I relocated. The version you knew stayed behind because it belonged there. I took the one you never met because it belonged forward. Leaving didn't erase you, it clarified me. I left without spectacle because truth doesn't need witnesses. You never met who I became, and that's exactly why I could finally go. I left with the version you never met, and for the first time I didn't look back to see